Welcome, everyone, to the fake news panel at the 2017 ESE Symposium. This was organized by the Ecological Sciences and Engineering Interdisciplinary Graduate Program as part of their annual symposium event. We have a great moderator and group of panelists up here today, and they're going to be talking about the subject of fake news. Throughout the event, please tweet in questions that can be answered on stage with the hashtag ESEFake that you can see up there. There will be a designated portion at the end for audience questions, but if there's a really good one throughout, it'll probably get asked. So I'll leave it to our moderator. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for coming today. If you saw the talk yesterday on fake news, you heard me talk a little bit about some of the precursors and the social vectors and the economic forces that led to the creation and promulgation of fake news, and some things that might be done in the future around this phenomenon. Today, we're very lucky to have three gentlemen to help us discuss how fake news is now. We're going to focus on the present situation and how to think about fake news in this environment of nonstop information and what it might mean. As you may know, we have Brad Pushkar and Kip Williams and Josh Skacko here. I did a fake news already, right? And here to discuss this. I will have them introduce themselves so you can understand where people are coming from the point of view. And I want to begin, I'll start with you, Mr. Skacko, by asking, talk about who you are and what you do, and address the question, how do you define what fake news is?
Mm-hmm. So good morning, everyone. My name is Josh Skacko, and I'm an assistant professor in the Brian Lamb School of Communication, and I focus on political communication. So it's a little bit of a busy time. Understatement of the century.
Yeah. For like 14 months now.
Yeah, for a long time. A lot of my research focuses on online news and understanding not only the content of it, but also how individuals are influenced by particular aspects of online news. So I'm going to give you three definitions. And this is how I kind of differentiate between what we're talking about here. So fake news is intentional viral deception. And the key thing to understand there is the intentionality behind it. Second definition that we might kind of get into and those types of things during our conversation today is bias news. Bias news is news with some kind of slant, with some kind of inherent lens that's put on the news that ultimately skews the information one way or another, but the information could be factual. Third definition is the news. And the news is information provided for a particular public affairs and or democratic purpose. And in that particular instance, that very much separates the motivations for what is real news versus what is fake news. So I don't necessarily like to group the term news in with fake, because in a lot of ways that's an inherent contradiction to what is the news.
Okay. And could you go ahead and name some names and cite a story or a site you consider a fake news?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one that immediately comes to mind is InfoWars. You look at the information that's promulgated on InfoWars, and it's. I often wonder whether or not it's not only based in facts that can be proven, but or facts that can be sought out, but also whether or not it's even based in reality in terms of how things can work and how things actually work. So I think that's a really great example of one potential piece of fake news that's out there.
Mm-hmm. Professor Williams?
My name is Kip Williams. I'm a professor of psychological sciences in the Department of Psychological Sciences. I am a researcher in social psychology, which generally is how do people affect people? How do we perceive people? How are we influenced by people? And I'm an editor of the journal Social Influence and an editor of the new handbook of social influence. So I'm coming at this from a psychological perspective in terms of how how do we choose what news to accept? How does it polarize our already existing beliefs? And I think another interesting aspect that needs to be looked at is just what is the impact of the constant allegation of fake news. So I agree with Josh's definitions of fake news. I just generally think fake news is intentional misdirection, miscommunication, misinformation that's done to not for satire purposes, but rather to pretend as though it actually is true. But I also think fake news is the allegation of fake news and how that affects our trust in news in general and what to select.
I'm sorry, say more about that. Fake news is the allegation of fake news?
That's the part of fake news that I'm particularly interested in, is that the new, I mean, we've had fake news for, I guess, centuries.
Right.
But at this point, it's something that we hear, the phrase fake news a lot. It's used, it's slung around all the time now.
I see. It is applied to those things that
it's applied to
are
any
causing
news.
you anxiety, basically.
Well, so when we are reminded, when that's in the air, the idea that this could be fake, this could be real, I don't really know, what does that do to us? How do we decide whether to believe it? How does it make us feel certain or less certain? And what are the downstream consequences of that lack of certainty of what to count on?
I was speaking beforehand with Professor Goldwasser, who's going to be speaking at 1:15 about developing algorithms, and we were talking about the structure of language almost as a, he said, regarding behavior on Twitter, but politically intentional language is much more like a computer language. It has codes and habits that are highly standardized and agreed upon, and that's not like normal language. And in fact, this makes it kind of easier to tag because it has these behaviors. And one of the interesting things I think in fake news, in terms of intentionality, is that it often seems to be identifying anyone who doesn't agree with the point of view as a dupe or a villain or somehow the enemy. It's very anti-democratic in that sense. And while conventional news sources might implicitly downplay those that don't agree with them, there isn't this overt language of dupe, deceiver inside it. And that's often a hallmark of real fake news, that
Real fake news.
Real fake news, like the authentic, the fake news my grandmother consumed, like artisanal fake news, right?
The realist fake news.
Yeah. But it's interesting in that sense because it seems to have a kind of social intention. If you don't believe this site, you're a dupe. Or if you leave the social network of people who believe InfoWars stories, you're joining the sheeple. You're, and that is a very different form of information consumption. It inflects differently. It causes anxiety to disagree with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've always had the phenomenon of disagreeing with the other side, and one way to deal with that is to argue with the point and provide other information. Another is to vilify the source, and I think still a third is to discredit the information as just being fake in the first place. And I think that it's an added layer of ambiguity that people are now having to cope with.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would also add that so much of this is about inoculation, right? It's about telling the people who agree with you to not go and look at other sources.
Yeah.
Because then you do become part of the establishment. You become part of the sheeple. You become part of something else.
Yeah.
So the language around this is one of inoculation. So
Right.
when the president calls something fake news, the allegation of fake news, calls something fake news, that is a form of inoculation. that's basically telling his supporters, don't read information other than the information that I am telling you to read. And in that way, that encourages that selectivity even more.
It would be interesting to analyze the ad click-through rates in authentically, full-bore fake news sites and see if they're higher because there's an implicit level of general belief that there wouldn't be in a broader understanding.
I read something, and you always have to preface everything on a panel like this because you don't know if it's accurate or not, right? So
It was in the National Enquirer.
Yeah, but it said that on Facebook, news that was most engaging, that resulted in the most shares, was fake news compared to actual news. And so it seems to be something that gets a lot of attention, and the way it's written, or the extremity of the
high
point that's
emotional
being
valence
made.
creates
Yeah,
the propensity to share.
It makes it more engaging.
Yeah. So I'll turn to you, Brad.
Of course. I'm Brad Pushkar. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Purdue Exponent. I've worked there as a reporter, as an editor. I've taken photography there for over a year now. I've also been studying mass communications here at Purdue, and I'm a part of Fast Track, the student-run news show, and I also work as a freelancer for WFI, the local TV station here. So to address your question of
how
fake
would you
news?
define fake news?
Yes. I think it's been really well covered by it is news that is intentionally false to deceive. And that intent is the biggest key word in there. If someone is told something that, like if a reporter is told that this event happens on October 3rd, 6 p.m., they write a story, and then all of a sudden there's a quick change in that scheduling, and it's happening actually on the 2nd, but they weren't informed before their deadline or something like that. That doesn't make the news fake. It just means that there was a miscommunication within the information, I feel. As well, one of the biggest, I think, recent news stories that kind of was going around that is fake news was during, I want to say Hurricane Harvey. A lot of photos were popping up with sharks on Houston
on the
highways,
Yeah.
and that did not happen at all in Houston.
That shark photo is like 4 years old.
Yeah, exactly. It was people were taking it and reposting it for different
Yeah.
stories and things like that. So.
Shark must be getting pissed at this point.
Yeah, right. Like he has a lot of royalties
I
that he
hate
could
Texas.
cash in on.
Like, why do you think I live in Texas?
But, yeah.
Okay. So in your role, obviously a very strong media role here at Purdue, have they actually let you into the science lab where the alien is being analyzed?
No, I have not been able to see the alien be analyzed yet.
Firm evidence that the alien exists. See, this is how
Exactly.
fake news gets going. Like, your denial is now material for my thing. And that was an absurd example, but there isn't really an alien. It is an absurd example. Okay,
Maybe.
good. Shows just how easy it is to give this kind of thing credits. But it also points to the difficulty of extracting what fake news might be. My intention was to entertain by making a joke. That's an Onion headline, right? Or the shark was kind of an Onion headline in a way. It's like, look at this shark, But do you think intention gets harder to perceive as things get passed around?
I believe so.
Yeah.
And especially, I think that the Onion itself has taken on this overarching. It's become this overarching entity that people know what the Onion is a lot
Right.
more than they did when it first started.
Right.
Things like that.
But the world's become so much like the Onion.
Yes.
But sorry, go ahead.
But with that, I would say that there's other satire sites that are not called The Onion,
Yeah.
and people don't know that other sites are satire in a way.
Yeah.
They don't look into it or read through the story and go, oh, this is actually totally crazy or weird.
It's particularly hard when they're not funny.
Yes.
But
Yes.
they think they're satirical.
And you should also distinguish between the intent of the source, is this for entertainment, this is for satire, but also the reception by the audience. So I know of instances where people read an Onion piece, were not familiar with its context, and thought it was real and got very incensed about it. And within my field, there was a huge problem with this video of a gorilla being taught that it was going to die, and the realization that it was going to die it had a devastating effect and caused depression in the gorilla.
Gorilla started smoking.
And people within my field did not realize it was an Onion or a satirical article. They contacted Tulane University, where the research was attributed, and at that point, for them, it's fake news, even though the intent wasn't fake. It was the intent was satire. So if you don't realize that it's satire, then the impact, the consequence, is just like fake news.
Now, fake news, as we say, is often applied to news, interpretation, information that people don't like, and but as you've just indicated, it starts getting gray really quickly, what is and what isn't fake. The intentionality plays into fake, or interpretation plays into fake, or that there isn't a shark on the highway, but man, there's a lot of water in Houston. There was also a guy catching fish in his living room. That appeared to be legit, in Houston. He was like walking around, grappling or something, these big catfish. And what's the point at which it isn't okay? Which there's innocent mistakes, there's interpretation, there's malicious intent. It's a little bit like porn, right? You know it when you see it, and nobody will admit to consuming it, but where can we actually get to a point where we identify fake news and say, yes, absolutely 100%? Or does everything, or is it in the conundrum all the other information is it has to be contextualized and seen in itself and expressed this way?
This is a difficult question in terms of the spectrum of what is and what is not fake news. I think one of the things that really at the root of so much of what we're getting at here is and I don't mean to get all philosophical, but this is a philosophical question of how people observe the world.
Philosophy matters.
This matters.
This is analysis.
In terms of thinking about their individuals, in terms of observing the world through observation and through finding information to support conjectures and those types of things, versus seeing the world through hunch, through gut.
Right.
And I know that there's a ton of work in psychology in terms of thinking about these as well. So much of this is I will talk with family members, for example, who fundamentally believe something. I had an interesting conversation with my dad yesterday related to what's going on with the NFL currently, and he fundamentally believed something was going on in college campuses related to rampant cheating by athletes. And I kept on saying, show me the evidence. Where's your evidence? And
You still talking?
Yeah, he's still talking. He's still talking after that. So I think that so much of this is about how individuals approach the world in terms of their own, we all approach it through particular observation, but I think for individuals who do research on these types of processes, part of our training is to kind of take ourselves out of it and use the methods that we use to speak for what we're trying to do. But that's a very different way of how many individuals approach the world. They think that their own particular perspective, they won't call it biases, but their own experience should lead the way in that regard, even if it is a flawed experience.
Right. Well, we have an audience question you might want to address there. Is wrong information a part of fake news?
Well, I mean, I go to the issue here of I like definitions. So what is wrong? So a great example.
I think it might mean mistake.
Okay, or mistaken perception, those types of things. But I think in this particular instance, if a person lives in a small town and in rural America and has never experienced a particular societal ill that might affect individuals in a bigger city, and they have a particular perception of it. That perception might be mistaken, but that might also be based in experience, in their own experience, that is valid in terms of what they've observed in their small town.
Did you want to say?
Well, I mean, I'm just sort of repeating what you said, in that if it's an error in communication, something that you would get an erratum for the next day, wrong information, I wouldn't categorize that as fake news, in that it wasn't written with the intent to dupe people. So I think that wrong information by itself is not sufficient to be called fake news.
Yeah, you seem to be on the side of intentionality.
I am, but I'm also on the side of perception of the audience. So I realize that it doesn't really matter what the intention is. If someone believed that it was a real item, even though it was meant to be satirical, then for them, it's going to have the same consequence of fake news. And they're going to have a bit of an undermining effect once they realize that it was satirical, that they can't count on it, that there's just yet another example where they thought something was true and wasn't. And I think this cumulatively makes us sort of like ships adrift at sea without a rudder. And we don't have anything to kind of hold on to as a truth.
Now, Brad, I'm going to accuse you of being young. Do you feel that your peers, other students here, consume information differently from the likes of me, old people? And does that affect the fake news quality?
I'll say yes and no. I believe it depends on, I mean, it really depends on the person, because there are some people that still read the newspaper every day. They, pick it up,
Sure.
go through it,
Obviously,
fill the crossword out.
There's a spectrum.
Yeah. But I think that there is one inherent difference, and it's social media. And obviously, older generation has started to come up on social media a lot more, both on Twitter, Facebook, things like that. But the readily available ability to share news with social media, I think, has changed the way that a lot of people look at news.
Right.
I think that it's a lot less of going to the website and seeing what the stories are that day from CNN or from the Exponent, things like that. But instead, it needs to pop up on your Twitter feed for you to click on it and
Right.
things like that.
And that's an interesting kind of another dimension of the abusive level of fake news in a way. It's I was speaking yesterday about circles of trust and how you trust your own experience, you trust the word of your friends, you trust news, then you sort of trust lawyers and corporations and governments like way out there. And fake news is often leveraging that second circle of trust your friends to jump in ahead of the news, even though it has a harder level of believability, as it were, but it's leveraging the fact that it's coming from your friends to give it credence. And that is kind of, it seems like a benefit, but it's also a hazard. And I'm wondering if there isn't a kind of, if you're seeing an awareness of this and an awareness of the literacy of attribution analysis, where did you get this fact from, among your friends discussing stories in a way we kind of never did in the same way.
Well, and I think it also, with you having the ability to like kind of curate who brings information towards you with that, it can create a bit of an echo chamber. And I think that was kind of just looking at the last election, why there was so many people saying, oh, Hillary Clinton is clearly way in the lead, things like that. Like, it just seems like there's so much support. It's because that's the only people they're hearing from are other supporters of Clinton or other supporters of Trump.
I think that was certainly the case inside the Clinton camp as well, as best I could tell. Like, we should send her to Texas. No, you should probably go to Wisconsin. It was like, but anyway.
And that can just naturally cause a problem in a way, just because you are you know that you feel the same way on a lot of issues with, Billy over here, but Joe might have something else that
Right.
agrees with it, and you're like, oh, well, both of them must be right, things like that. So.
We have another question from the audience, and I'll make this jump ball. Address the role of cognitive dissonance in the fake news in the context of the 2016 election. I can play with that. Anybody else want it? Cognitive dissonance was kind of a constant in life, but
Yeah, so cognitive dissonance is this idea that there's cognitions that you have about yourself that are inconsistent, for which maybe you're hypocritical. So you might say one thing but behave in a way that goes directly opposite to that. And we don't like this sense of being hypocrites or being inconsistent, so we have to kind of work on one of the cognitions or the other to become consistent. So we start to justify behavior that we did that may be inconsistent with our thoughts.
taking $500,000 from Goldman Sachs for a speech, or denying you'd ever say, I grabbed them by the,
Whatever.
to speak of both candidates.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So cognitive dissonance just plays a role in the act of justifying what you've done. I'm not quite sure the intent of the question in terms of how it relates specifically to fake news. I guess if the writer could elaborate a little bit, it would be helpful.
Or we could interpret it. And
We can.
In that sense, fake news helps assuage cognitive dissonance by creating this urgency, this thing you can point at in the other direction. Well, the person who disagrees with me is really crazy. Look, they're helping the Queen of England sell drugs, and therefore I become a more coherent person because of their evil or bad side.
Right,
And
so it
that's what
gives you a
becomes the
lot of
solve.
information for which you can justify.
Yeah, it becomes the salve for this incoherent information environment we're in.
Well, and I think it also is very much tied to this notion of I'm going to throw out a term here, partisan selective exposure, which is this idea that we attend to information that supports our beliefs in some way, and in a political environment, we attend to information and we attend to information that agrees with our political beliefs, and we actively try to avoid other information. So in many ways, if the fake news already agrees with some preconceived notions that we have, we are going to be more likely to attend to it in the first place. Just because we don't like the discomfort caused by reading some opinion that might not agree with us. That creates that cognitive dissonance as well. So we actively try to avoid that in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's always the case that we selectively attend to things that we agree with.
Right.
I think at this point, though, it's gone up another level. It's notched up to a much greater extent through social media. So we are, not only do we select, we can click out things that we don't want to be exposed to, but the algorithms of the site are to give you information that's consistent with what you believe. And so we are really, every site is in an echo chamber where you just keep hearing and reading about things that you agree with, and this just serves to further polarize you from oppositional ideologies. And so it's at this point, it's much. We are just surrounded by selective processes that we do, but also that are being done for us by the algorithms of the sites.
Now, Brad, you're of an age where marketers love you because your choices aren't fixed yet.
Yes.
People like us, they know what we're going to buy. That's why you're such a choice demographic in terms of TV advertising, the 18 to 35 group. I'm interested in your experience in the 2016 election. Did you go in with a hard political point of view, and did you see a lot of news go back and forth?
That's
Where I'm
you're
going
making
is
me remember way too long ago. That's,
Okay, I can ask you a different question.
yeah. Well, the way I kind of, I don't believe. I mean, I don't remember the way I went into it with.
Well, how did the paper cover it, for example?
Well, especially with the election, when it was coming up, we went and looked at all three major candidates' stances on various issues. I know abortion was one, global warming was another. I want to say like maybe taxes or something like that. But we looked at, Trump, looked at Clinton, we looked at Johnson, had basically a list of this is what all these people stand for. From what we can gather, both online, from what the college Democrats, college Republicans, college Libertarians have said about what they think, like how they feel about these candidates and things like that. So it was a try to get as much information about these candidates as possible.
But in hearing back from students, did you start to hear a lot of this kind of dissonance in terms of people pulling in fake news or what appeared to be in opinions inflected by fake news?
I think you'll always get an opinion that whether or not it's fake news or not, it's always something that's been incredibly biased, I feel. And I was not completely I wasn't part of the group that was receiving all this, so I'm not 100% on all of these things. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to kind of speak on another candidate that maybe you aren't politically aligned with and not have some kind of bias towards a fake.
As you become more invested in your own candidate, the others.
You want to have more reason why your candidate is better.
Yeah. And I'm going somewhere with this question.
That's fine.
What's your major?
Mass communications.
Mass communications.
Yes.
Oh. Hermano. Okay. Do you feel that, I was hoping for a hard science answer because in general, no, do you feel that fake news, the idea of fake news, the idea of biased information more broadly hurts, and this is a general question too, science and learning and thought? Does it exist just in the context of like news consumption, or is it more broadly pernicious to the idea of science and learning?
I think it can hurt science and the way that science releases new information about studies, research, things like that, because as science evolves, it hopefully gets more unbelievable in a way.
That's a great line.
Yeah, it's like, the day that, if there is ever a day that cancer is cured, are people really going to believe that at first? It's been for so long something that people have looked at as, well, it's being researched and we want to find an answer, but it's just not there for us. So when the day that cancer really is cured, are people going to believe it? Are they going to say, oh, that's fake, it didn't actually happen, or things like that? But I would hope that they look at the sources or look at the research that is inevitably released.
Still
with
trust authorities,
things like
as
that.
it were.
Yeah.
Are you seeing any effect in social sciences?
Certainly, we have our own issues with respect to, if not purposely fake, results of studies that maybe
Data
aren't
biases.
replicable and are more fragile than originally thought. And so I think that we see sort of a parallel thing going on in social sciences and hard sciences as well. When information is published, even in a peer-reviewed journal, if it's found out later that the data are suspect, either because the person faked their data, which I think happens very infrequently, or when it's done in such a way that perhaps the results are biased in a particular direction because of various gray area practices, it undermines people's faith in what they're reading and in the field. And so I definitely think that fake news is playing out in the sciences as well.
Yeah, I can't sort out whether it is steering or whether it is also a consequence of some larger thing, which is this rise of contextualized information. But where university research is concerned, sources of funding in the research have entered into part of the discussion. you got tobacco money, you were funded by Google, you were funded by Microsoft, therefore your results are suspect.
Yeah, and that's always been the case. I just think that now it's more accessible, these questionable things, and it's becoming part of the narrative of the conversation. So everything is always in the context of bias or fake. And so you have maybe a large number of people, scientists, who think one thing, but you have a few that think another, and they're given equal time, so to speak, in terms of let's listen to all sides, and these people claim the data are fake, and so you end up having people not sure what to believe in.
So that if you, do you think that's going to change the way you publish or the way your peers publish, where you state your potential biases somewhere high up in the paper?
It has changed. So we have open science. We have where you pre-register your experiments online so that everybody can see what you're going to do, what you think is going to happen, how you're going to do it, how you're going to analyze your results, so that you can't find something and change your story to say that's what we were expecting to find in the first place. So it definitely is affecting how science is playing out.
That sounds quite positive.
Yeah, so there are some definitely good consequences of some of these questionable practices that have happened in the past. Whether they solve all the problems remains to be seen, but I think it does make the whole process more transparent.
To be clear, I'm not saying, yay, fake news, you've caused greater transparency. I'm saying that in a world where attribution is becoming increasingly more important and point of view is understood to be part of communication, stating that openly has become a kind of defense of truth.
I think that there's also a normative angle here in terms of thinking about small d democratic, what's going on here, which is you have one of the intentions of fake news and one of the intentions of allegations of fake news, throwing out allegations, is to make individuals question everything, is to make individuals doubtful of all information. And for political leaders to succeed, they have to be able to construct a particular reality. And this is Donald Trump, this is Barack Obama, this is any political leader has to construct a particular reality.
Was this always true?
In a lot of ways, so much of politics is taking an aspect of reality and blowing it up and saying this is how we live, this is a problem, and so the question then becomes: if the candidate is supporting a particular reality, do the facts on the ground support the reality? If not, then you need to find a way to make facts support the reality. And that's where fake news can come in, because in that way, and I think in a lot of ways, it's very appropriate that so much of what we talked about in the 2016 election and what we're hearing about now, is that so much of the fake news was, Russia was at the root of so much of it, because in an authoritarian regime, facts are the most dangerous thing. Information, actual real information, is the most dangerous thing. So by putting information out there and making people doubtful of the information that they have traditionally believed in, that can then pave the way for authoritarian leaders, for populism and those types of things. And I think that is the thing that we need to be concerned about, no matter what political persuasion a person may be. Is that we had a foreign power using information against us, engaging in information warfare against the United States, and we still have a president of the United States who denies it most of the time, 95% of the time, 5% if he wants to, but 95% of the time denies it. And this is an issue, because we know that in a lot of ways, this will happen again. And so I think we have to look at all the particular angles of this and ask, what is the big intention of this? And the big intention at a macro level is to make us question everything. until we don't know
Well,
what is reality.
the way I put it yesterday was, it's not just that the Russians, that Putin is after the American election. Duterte in the Philippines, the Catalan election, Le Pen in France, and it's not about installing any particular kind of leader as
Right.
much as creating an aura of cynicism about the democratic process. Because if there's confusion about the functional nature of democracy, there'll be a greater tendency towards authoritarianism.
Right. I was reading a really interesting story about Brazil as a great example of this. And obviously, Brazil has had a string of very problematic corruption issues in the past decade.
Past couple centuries, but
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But in a lot of ways, trust in democracy has fallen to an historic low
Right.
in Brazil. As a great example of that. Brazil is critical in terms of thinking about, trade in the Americas, but also trade with the rest of the world. So sowing chaos in a country like Brazil could have ripple effects as well.
Okay, so what is to be done? How does one restore the value of truth? How does one create a consensus about truth or the process of finding something like truth? Just to put it in that highly contextualized.
Yeah.
I guess in following through with the transparency idea, if you have an article where you may not have had citations and sources easily viewable, maybe this will increase the use of clickable citations so you can go to the original source, see how it was done, and see if you buy into the methods that got those results. That maybe it could potentially lead to a more informed audience, because they're asking the same questions. Where'd you get your information? Where's the evidence? And so if you make that evidence more easily accessible, then maybe that will improve people's being good consumers of research, so that they just don't buy an article, but they go back and look further. I'm not so certain that's going to happen. I think people aren't that.
It sounds like
don't work that hard. Yeah, I think that people get to be lazy. So I guess when I'm thinking about this doom or dawn thing, I'm at the moment more doom than dawn. So when you say, what can we do about it? I think it's going to make people less and less certain, and they're going to grasp onto an authoritarian leader or someone that's very powerful more easily. And so I'm worried about it.
Can I resolve doom or dawn, by the way? I've been dying to do this on stage.
Sure.
It's dawn, but if it's dawn of a new day, that means some old things are doomed. Okay, are we done? So you can call me the cheerful pessimist, right?
Okay.
or the dark optimist, whichever you like. Dark optimist is probably good. That's like my Street Fighter name. But what you identify here is very important, I think, and that is a way of discerning fake news frequently is the vector by which it travels into the discourse. Like a ton of Twitter bots are backing this stuff. It's about the Queen of England, but it came out of Romania at 1 o'clock in the morning, and instantly 50 Twitter bots and then 10,000 Twitter bots were pushing it.
Right.
Like, that's just weird. That's not how, and then it hit certain key social figures, and they retweeted it, and that gave it credence, and then friends. And so you can map this course by which it comes in, which is very different from the way Drudge would report something, or the way the New York Times would report something, the way a more conventional outlet to pick, what people consider two different sides would report something. It's a whole different vector, away from just leveraging social media. If that is the case, do companies like Twitter and Facebook and Google have some moral obligation to become involved and identify this and stop it? Is that their job? And do you want them to be the moral gatekeepers for society?
I want to say no, as it shouldn't be they shouldn't be the only ones to say, if that kind of makes sense.
They have the greatest visibility, though.
True,
You know,
but it should. I think that there's always a problem with if we depend on a couple of like sites or ideas. I won't. Or I shouldn't say ideas or ideologies, but just a few places to control what really shows up places. Then there's the inherent problem of, well, if there's a true article about Google that says they've been stealing all of your data off your computer for the last 20 years. We'll just go out of left field. And Google says, oh, well, that's fake, but it's true. How are people going to see something like that? Same with Yahoo, same with Bing for the 45 people that use Bing. But
Be nice. Be nice. Not taking the bait. But yes, we would. They have a greater visibility, but we'd be affording a corporation a power akin to the state textbook authority. Really choosing the fundamental, the foundational information people have in the world. But your views? Should they take on that role? And if so, isn't that censorship?
Well, it's censorship if they remove it, I suppose, from the site. It's less censorship if they tag it as questionable.
Fair.
So, and I think whatever they can do to try to research the article and to tag it is probably good, except that there was a study that was just published in our field that says tagged information doesn't decrease its believability.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So at least so far, given the study that was done, it seems like a nice idea, but perhaps it's not really having the impact that people thought it would.
Wow. I mean, so I can just paste the word fake, pants on fire, 5 Pinocchios across the Queen of England's face, and it doesn't even slow them down?
Right, because you can disbelieve the tag and think the tag is fake.
Right.
And secondly, you can forget the...
You would think that.
Yeah, and then secondly, you can have what's sometimes called a sleeper effect. So you go, oh, this is fake, and then over time you remember the information and you forget the tag. And so it becomes real over time, where initially you were aware that it was fake. Those things start to separate in your memory, and what's left is the information, and you think it's true.
Yeah, I used to subscribe to the Weekly World News, and I stopped when somebody pointed this out to me. It's like, someday you're going to say Elvis had an alien baby, and you're not going to remember where you heard it.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is a difficult question because as a democracy, we are going to have to grapple with issues related to free speech and free press, and the extent to which we need to put any type of regulation or limit on it. What I will say is that if you look at Facebook, if you begin to think about Facebook less as just a business corporation and more as a media company,
I'm having trouble differentiating between the two right there.
Well, media companies are corporations, but if you take the profit motive out of it, and then you look at Facebook as a purveyor of information for individuals, then it becomes a matter of asking, well, what does the news do right now? And we know that the news can't necessarily cover everything. It covers particular aspects of reality. It frames them in particular ways, even regular news. And also, they act as a filter for bad information. It doesn't even make it on the front page of the New York Times most of the time. And so the question is, are companies like Facebook and Twitter going to operate more in kind of that journalistic style of, if they're taking bad information out before it reaches people, they're essentially doing the role of what a journalist does. Are they going to operate in that particular space? And I think that's a question that Facebook in particular is grappling with at this moment as they turn over advertisements bought by Russians to the FBI and to investigators. So I think for a lot of it, it depends on how we view these particular entities.
Can I kind of build off of that? And,
No,
or
go ahead.
This whole question, I should say. Like, if we're looking at a Facebook or a Twitter, controlling what or marking things or posts and things like that, if it is not the company deciding what it is, but rather the users who are reading these stories and possibly doing their own fact checking, but report it as this is a fake story or this is false information, is that better than letting the company run it?
Right. Well, and again, I think you run into the same biases that, again, and saying that journalists also don't have these particular inherent worldviews and lenses, that would be a false statement. They do. But you run into similar issues of perception in terms of, partisan selectivity, cognitive dissonance among users as well. Everything's going to get tagged as fake news.
Yes, that's what's going to happen, is that people that don't agree with it are going to tag it as fake. And then that's going to have no meaning whatsoever.
It's kind of happening at a very high level already.
Right.
I've been given a 10-minute signal, is that right? And that means we can take questions from the audience. Please come down and speak to the microphone. And I'll pick up another question from Twitter. The role of misinformation in discrediting and creating doubt in key scientific topics like anti-vaxxing, climate change are two particularly well-known ones. How do you see that dynamic? Does it start with legitimate dispute? Is it particular interest trying to leverage things? Does fake news kind of augment and propel these problems?
I'll just jump in and say that I just became an uncle for the first time. I was talking with my brother, and he lives in Atlanta, and before I see him, the doctor's recommending that I am up on my whooping cough vaccination. Whooping cough was, essentially eradicated until individuals stopped getting immunizations. And so now, the very real consequences of the decisions of a very small number of individuals, because this is all that it takes, a very small number of individuals in a health context, makes me have to jump through an extra hoop of making sure that I am current on this vaccination. And you're seeing this across the United States. I mean, there are communities in California where the rates of measles and mumps are higher than the national average because you have individuals who are not vaccinating their children.
And you feel that the fake news has kind of led them to take those steps?
I think that always determining the 100% causal relationship is difficult, but I think the availability of information that counteracts public health experts, as well as well-known kind of celebrity cases, as well as the mistaken citation or one of two very problematic academic articles, which always seems to happen in these circumstances, that people point to the one or two academic articles that say that there's a link, and yet the academic community is saying, well, hold on, there are these problems with that study.
Yes.
That it's confirming some inherent distrust that individuals have of institutions, of corporations, and this is something else that I think is important for all this conversation, which is that this only works in an environment where people already distrust their institutions. That if people have robust trust in their institutions, they're not going to say, well, pharmaceutical companies are really out to control us.
Right.
So.
Right. And in the case of the anti-vax, it was particularly difficult because it was a British doctor who falsified his information to create this sense that vaccines were doing these terrible things. This gets picked up and re-amplified, particularly by a number of celebrities who we somehow give intellectual authority as well, just because they look good in films, but that's life. It reifies, I think it was Stalin, I'm not sure, who said, a lie can travel around the world while truth is still putting on its boots.
It's amazing how that comes from Stalin. That makes sense.
He knew his market.
He did.
And that's so much easier now with social media. I mean, things, isolated, lack of evidence information can get out there and get equal time with a lot information that has lots of evidence backing it up, and then it looks like there's two reasonable sides.
Right.
And it happens so quickly now and so easily that that would have been a lot harder to do prior to the internet and social media.
One of the changes I've seen in the news business in my time is the idea of reporting a controversy about something with the same strength and energy, if not more, than the thing itself. Like the argument about something becomes the story.
Yeah.
You know, and I spent several years on a certain TV network, and there were some emails about among climate scientists, and they seized on the particular parsing of a particular email among 10,000 emails where a guy said he might jigger some numbers. And it's not clear he even did. But that was evidence of this massive overarching conspiracy.
Right.
And the controversy around this, and when people pointed out, it's like statistically that means nothing. It's like, well, there's a lot of controversy here around this argument. You can then spin back what you were saying. And it's not exactly fake, which is kind of the larger problem.
Right.
It's like umbral fake news. You're sort of dealing in this shadow thing.
I mean, in science, you have many, many studies, and some studies are going to not work or maybe even go in the opposite direction, but what we'll try to rely on are meta-analyses, where we look at a large number of studies, recognizing that any individual study is going to perhaps have flaws, and then you can look at the meta-analysis to see if you see a robust effect and what things are actually there and what things aren't. And when you instead just are able to pull the one exception out and give it equal time and equal weight to the 99% majority and make people be able to believe that because it's getting equal time on the network. Then
But in a way, you have to be schooled in science thinking, for that to work. You have to sort of have that scientific training to say, yeah, we're assuming everything is a theory, and it might be challenged by new data. But that doesn't mean we're dealing in fakes or we're in ignorance. Like, we're actually moving towards we're in truth moving to greater truth. But that does raise this question we're getting from Twitter. As scientists, how do we keep our work from being used in fake news? Does everybody have to start developing the mental rigor and analysis means of a scientist? I mean, are we going to have to teach this new meta-literacy among people?
I mean, I think that sometimes comes down to the journalists making sure that they understand what they're reading. If you don't know how to understand what this research about biology is saying, try to find someone who does and have them help explain it to you, things like that. Because you don't want to report something inaccurately. Things like that.
But also we do have findings that come out and they're misinterpreted and used to argue the opposite point to what we meant. And I guess it's our responsibility to keep up on that and to speak out when we think our research is being misunderstood or misused.
That's right.
It
because
does put the obligation on us, I think.
Yeah, the journalist agenda can be quite different. And not even often with the reporter, but with the editor at a remove, and it creates this weird newsroom dynamic. I write a lot about AI, and 9 times out of 10, somebody will make an AI breakthrough. Somewhere along the line, somebody's going to want to put a picture of the Terminator on the story, right? Skynet is coming. We're that much closer to Skynet. Like, Skynet is not coming. That is not a thing that's going to happen. I'm sorry. But the editor's like, oh, this is how we get people to read it, and this is our way in,
Right.
and like,
Well, and this is, I think, this is a hard news bias, which is this bias towards balance.
Yeah.
It's a bias in and of itself because it does give equal time in ways that oftentimes we shouldn't give equal times. This was a big conversation about climate change for so long.
Right.
And I think news outlets have gone in a direction where they're much better about reporting on something like climate change and not bringing up the one person who's carrying the banner for the 2% of the scientific community that's basically saying climate change isn't happening. So I think that is something important that we have to recognize here, which is that the news, by the way that it frames stories, it can become very problematic very quickly.
Okay.
We have a person at the
Oh,
mic.
sorry. Great, we have a question. And then I think it's going to be our last question, right? Because we're out of time. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question about your discussion about information literacy.
Okay.
I used to be an adjunct professor in communication, and as part of an information literacy lesson plan I did, I would teach my students to use Snopes to find out if something they read on the internet was accurate or inaccurate. And by and large, everybody agreed. When they saw the evidence in Snopes, they believed it.
Right.
Now I'm running into things where I'm on Facebook and I get in a conversation where somebody is literally sharing fake news. I look it up on Snopes. I see it as my obligation to share with people. This is not true. And I read it on Snopes. And now I'm getting pushback from some people who say, well, Snopes is fake news. It's a liberal conspiracy. And I'm wondering, how do you address that?
Okay. I don't think your mic was on, so I'll repeat it for the audience. Snopes has been, for many people, they push back if I'm misrepresenting, but Snopes has been, for many people, a very good means of checking facts and seeing if there is bias or where a meme or a bit of fake news might have come from. The questioner said she will cite Snopes now on Facebook, and people will say, Snopes is liberal bias. Snopes is also fake news. What do you do about that? I have some thoughts, but I'll defer to our group.
This is the real danger. Right now, it's so easy to just say fake news. That we have a role model.
It disagrees with my worldview.
Just throws it
QED,
out
it's
now
fake
whenever
news.
it disagrees. So it's in the air when you're thinking, when you hear anything, you immediately think, is it real or is it not? And someone can sit there and claim that a fact-checking source is fake news, this is the proliferation of this allegation that's having this undermining effect that I worry about.
Yeah, I think it's part of the larger trend to discredit everything.
Right.
And it sows chaos.
I think there is a kind of Snopes on Snopes you can do, though, because they have also posted on how liberal bias things are wrong. And you can show that Snopes has addressed both sides of these things. And you may be uncomfortable with that, but it falls to you to annotate your facts. In that case, I've annotated mine. Depending on how much time you want to spend on Facebook, of course. That's the other problem.
Right.
This is,
Never
a
ending.
complete war against the Hydra. You cut the head off and two spring up.
Uh-huh.
That said, I believe that's all the time we have. If there's a lightning round of anything, otherwise we've covered it. Anything you want the audience to walk away thinking more than anything?
I mean, I'll just add that Snopes is a great site, but I also go, factcheck.org is a phenomenal site run by the University of Pennsylvania, the Annenberg Public Policy Center. PolitiFact are also great sites. And I think, Quentin, you bring up a really excellent example here that they take all sides to task.
Yeah.
Basically. And I think that can be shown as evidence in and of itself. Yes. That they are looking at these types of claims very carefully.
Their motives are pure. All right. Well, okay, I was going there. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks.